I'll get you to reintroduce yourselves for the group and also tell us a little bit more about you.
So my name's Biola Araba. This is my third year of advanced training. As part of my role, I'm the Senior Fellow for the Center for Community Child Health, which is technically a mentorship role for more junior advanced trainees in community child health, and involves coordination of educational activities within the department as well too. I also have 2 days out in the community where I work mainly in the capacity of clinical work in developmental and behavioral pediatrics.
Thanks, Mick. My name's Gehan Roberts. I'm a developmental paediatrician at RCH Melbourne. We were very lucky to appoint Biola to the Senior Fellow role, which we really see as a bridge between junior trainees and early consultant practice. So I supervise fellowship training and our clinical service. I've been supervising trainees for the last 8 to 10 years or so. And look, I was keen to give this pilot a go, especially because a Senior Fellow role involves a nice mix of clinical and non-clinical activities.
Well, on that note, now what EPAs did you choose and why?
Thank you, Mick. So we chose 5 EPAs. Eventually we completed 4 of them. These were within the domains of written communication and developmental and behavioral pediatrics, also in the domain of planning and implementation of a new population health program. We also thought it would be nice to look at teaching in community child health, as well as research skills in community child health. And fifthly, we looked at office-based interventions in developmental and behavioral pediatrics.
What were your initial expectations of the EPA pilot, and were these expectations met?
Well, as you know, I was part of the initial working group, so I was very interested to see how it would play out in real life. I think we obviously did a lot of prep beforehand, so we started it with an expectation of success. What I was really hoping is that it would give me a more structured way to carry out my supervision activities, and the other thing I was really hoping for is to have or develop a more objective way to gather evidence for that final goal of being able to entrust certain activities to Biola. And I think these were met along the way.
Do you have some thoughts on that, Biola?
Thank you, Mick. I agree with everything that Gehan, my supervisor, has said. From a trainee perspective, I did expect that the pilot would provide me with opportunities for direct observation of my medical, say, clinical skills, as well as my communication skills as well, too, which I think are very essential in developmental and behavioral pediatrics, and which I felt would be more regular than prior to when we started the EPA program.
Now, how do you think the EPA pilot has impacted on your performance as a trainee and as a supervisor?
Thank you, Mick. Well, from a trainee perspective, I would say it's made me more aware of areas that I could improve in the specified domains in my clinical training. And I think it has also improved my professional awareness of what is expected of me as a trainee.
For me as a supervisor, I think it's forced me to be more structured. So what we did up front was to set very clear meeting times and very clear expectations for those meeting times. So I think as a supervisor, I was greatly helped by having Biola as a very motivated trainee who was at the end of her training pathway and had clear ideas as to what she wanted to achieve. So I think that structure was very helpful. But probably on the flip side, the challenges were the time commitment. So there was definitely an increased time commitment. Not so much an issue for the non-clinical EPAs such as teaching, where I could schedule in observation time of Biola, for example, presenting or facilitating journal club. But during the clinical times, our unit is Medicare funded clinical service, and obviously there are issues with blocking off consultant clinical time in order to observe, but observation being a critical part. So I think those sort of time pressures were something that we had to work through and figure out the logistics of.
And did you expect that was going to happen? You were sort of imagined that might be the case and worked around it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we agreed up front that we had to do it, that there was no way I could sign off on a clinical skills-based EPA unless I was absolutely in the room observing those things happening. But, you know, we had to then make sure that the correct patient or the correct kind of presentation, and then we were both free and the patient turned up, and there were all the kind of logistics things which we were responsible for organising, really. Mm-hmm.
I know when I first heard the term entrustable professional activity, I was intrigued, but I was clueless as to what it really could mean. So I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that, having lived the EPA dream, having actually put these EPAs to work, that you'd be in a good position to explain to others what EPAs are about. So I'm going to give you a little scenario. Now, Biola, you're having coffee with a trainee colleague who's new to the concept of EPAs, and we'll be using them in the next rotation. So what advice would you have for your colleague about selecting his or her EPAs?
Okay, thank you, Mick. That's an interesting scenario, and I think my approach would be to outline some key areas that I think that my colleague would need to consider before they decide to register to do the EPAs. I think I'd start off with recommending that the trainee looks critically at areas they would like to improve on in their clinical training, and think about what sort of experience they'd like to get out of the EPA program as well too. I'd also like to highlight that it's important to aim for feasible goals, because it's not a lot of time, and a whole year goes by really quickly, so it's important to make sure that it's structured and targeted towards those time limitations. But also I think it's important that very early on in the training year that the set EPA targets are highlighted in terms of dates and times. So it's important to select beforehand what dates you'd like to meet as much as is possible, given that, as Gehan very rightly mentioned, it's not always easy to synchronize meeting times, especially when the opportunities might not be pre-planned.
Right, so locking it in up front as much as you can.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank
Okay,
you.
great. Gehan, you are having, I've got you down for a chai latte.
Nice choice.
Good.
Thank you.
With one of your supervisor colleagues who's also new to the concept of EPAs and will be implementing it with his or her trainee in the next rotation. What advice would you give your supervisor colleague who's helping their trainee decide on their EPAs?
I think probably the most important thing they could do is meet with their trainee either very, very early in that rotation, or ideally just before the rotation starts, so they can build really a shared understanding of where they want to go during that rotation. So the supervisor might bring all their expectations about the clinical service and the education, etc., and the trainee would bring their expectations ideally about how they want to change during the course of the rotation. So I think what I would advise my supervisor colleague is to really have a good understanding of where the trainee has come from up till that point and what they'd like to get out of the rotation, and be able to sort of balance that with what the trainee wants to achieve in terms of which EPAs they want to progress. So, and probably the other thing is, as Biola said, is to prospectively lock away protected supervision time that's not just sort of reactive clinical supervision, but more big picture supervision around progress towards achieving those goals.
Mm-hmm. And just picking up on Biola's point about making it realistic, do you think a supervisor has a role in, say you have an incredibly enthusiastic trainee who wants to tick off 1 million EPAs in one rotation, what's the supervisor's role there?
Well, I think we started off probably more enthusiastically than we should have. The clinical EPAs were relatively straightforward. The non-clinical EPAs were more challenging because they were involved more people than just the trainee, supervisor and patient. For example, the research ones involved a whole other research team And Biola's challenges there were to get people to respond back in a timely fashion so she could move her work forward. So I think reality checking up front and also reality checking during the course of the supervision term are both really important.
Thank you very much, guys. Really appreciate
welcome.
hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank Biola.